calling out David Seymour.
Well, thank you, Mr Chair, and I've been waiting patiently for an opportunity to respond to the many interesting points that have been raised in this debate. Mr Chair, I'll address my comments as tightly as I can to parts 9 and 10 that are currently on the table, but it's worth considering various provisions in both the Housing Act 1955 and the Public Works Act 1981, because here in the real world, those pieces of legislation all interact. They influence the property of New Zealanders, not only bare land that may have become Crown land acquired under the Public Works Act or some other act in the past, but also the homes that people have recently bought that have been built on that land. And Mr Chair, I look across at the Labor Party today that is an embarrassment to the giants who built it, a party that wants to build 100,000 houses, a party that wants to build 100,000 homes through government, but will not seriously consider, engage with or understand the legislative underpinnings that would be required to do so. Mr Chair, the fact of the matter is that under the Public Works Act sections 40 through 42, as it stands, the first right of refusal is exempt in a number of circumstances, including where the land has been developed. Mr Chair, under the 1955 Housing Act, it is possible for the government to use Crown land to develop and build housing. Those are the facts, and that is what governments of both stripes have been doing for a very long time. It is what no doubt the Greens would have done had they ever made it into government. So when we inherit this history, we have to think very carefully about the different stakeholders involved and how the law will influence their interests going forward. There is an inherent conflict between the Public Works Act and the Housing Act. There is a conflict in saying that the government has a role in developing and building housing on Crown land, and yet the government also has a requirement to give a first right of refusal to people who may have had their land taken compulsorily under the Public Works Act in the past. Mr Chair, that conflict does not sit easily with me because, unlike the Labor Party, I do not believe that the government should be in the housing development business. There is no public policy justification for the government to be building houses. There are many reasons why the government might compulsorily acquire land. Mr Chair, one might imagine a government attempting to build a road from Auckland to Wellington with one or two people opportunistically holding out and preventing their property from being sold for any price, hoping to gain a rent off the New Zealand public in the construction of the road. For those reasons, we can understand why there might be a Public Works Act and why the government might compulsorily acquire private citizens' land. But, Mr Chair, there is no good reason for the government to acquire land simply so it can do housing development. That is something that Parliament needs to address in the future, but nonetheless not something that could be addressed in the current timeframe. And let me explain a little bit about why that timeframe is so tight and why I cannot support the supplementary order papers that have been put on the table by Materia Ture to delete section 9 and 10 and by Phil Twyford, I think it is, to have part 2 of this bill sent off to a select committee. As I have said, there is an inherent conflict between the Public Works Act and the Housing Act. And what that inherent conflict opens up is the possibility of an opportunistic challenge, an opportunistic legal challenge, where land that has been taken at some past time, subsequently developed by the government, which the government should never do, even though Labor thinks it should, and then sold to people who, Mr. Chair.
David Seymour.
And sold to people who are now homeowners, often working-class homeowners that the Labor Party should stand up for, who are trying to pay their mortgage, may find themselves subject to an opportunistic legal challenge where they could actually have their property rights and their livelihood under threat. And the thing about property rights is that they tend to conflict with each other. This is just the real world that is affected by the legislation that we are making today in this House. But then other members have said, well, why? Why can't we at least take more time? Well, what if we were to send this away to Select Committee for, say, 6 months? Within a year, we might have actually managed to pass legislation somehow clarifying this problem. But the reality is that leaves a year of uncertainty and a year of potential legal challenge to people's livelihoods. And I think that would be an absolute disgrace. It would be imperiling the rights of New Zealanders, and that is not the sort of thing that this parliament should be doing. Nonetheless, I agree with the newfound belief in due process and private property rights that Materia Ture has recently exhibited. I agree with what Annette King has been barracking from the other side of the House, that due process and private property rights are important. I hope she'll remind caucus of that next time they have a Kiwi Bill discussion. Because, Mr. Chair, it is wrong for the government to take land for anything other than a tightly circumscribed set of public policy purposes where there is a genuine market failure and the taxpayer is frankly at risk of extortion. Housing development is one of those, and this area of the law needs to be tightened up over a longer time frame that is currently available, because right now, having put this bill on the table in public in the House, we have invited opportunistic legal challenges to people who have already bought homes on what was formerly Crown land. So what I have done is negotiated with the Minister to support this bill on the basis that we will improve public policy in the long run. And people opposite have scoffed at the fact, yes, and the current scenario would also be retrospective, Mr. Robertson. You are so petulant and puerile, you trip yourself up and fail to engage with the real issues. Mr. Chair, Mr. Robertson would look a lot more dignified in his mistakes.
Point of order, Grant Robertson. Point of order.
Mr. Chair, I take offence at being described in the way that the member just described me and ask him to withdraw and apologise.
Well, this is a pretty robust debate. and I'm on my feet, and the member has taken offence. I'll ask the member to withdraw the comment.
I withdraw the comment, Mr.
David,
Chair. Thank you. Isn't it interesting how thin-skinned and sensitive they are when it really gets going? Mr. Robertson's various errors and mistakes could be made with so much more dignity if only he carried himself in a more dignified manner normally. But, Mr. Chair, members opposite have been saying it is a poor deal to have a 10-year review. Well, let me just explain to members opposite why a 10-year review is a much shorter time than they might otherwise imagine. People from the Labor Party aren't normally accustomed to being in business, but let me explain to them that when you do a development, particularly a property development, the cycle is roughly 10 years. What this means is that any future developments that are going to be contemplated by folks out there are going to run into the very uncertainty that this bill looks to clarify, and they're going to run into it very soon if they're going to begin a development in the near future. So what has been achieved by the supplementary order paper with a 10-year sunset clause on parts 9 and 10 is that it will force this House to revisit, not so long from now, the fundamental questions of when honestly, it is actually really quite difficult to get anything across to the education spokesperson. He really has not managed to hear the very simple things I've been saying for the last 30 seconds. Yes, it is a decade, Mr Hipkins, but if your lead time for development is a decade, then you need to start thinking about it now, and the House will come under pressure to resolve this issue very soon. If I could just reply to what Grant Robertson is saying, Mr Chair, could I, Mr Chair.
I'm going to call Dennis O'Rourke.